chair this subcommittee and its oversight responsibilities of our nation's primary land and air forces. Not sure how a Navy guy got this job, but don't worry, I'm not going to start asking Army and Air Force pilots to land on the ship. And luckily, I've got an Army guy next to me to partner with. And Senator Cotton, I look forward to working with you and all of the committee members as we continue the subcommittee's collaborative approach during this critical time. And I know we can find broad agreement within the subcommittee and work jointly to confront the issues facing our soldiers, our airmen, and their families. And I would like to welcome our witnesses to the hearing this afternoon, Mr. Douglas Bush, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, General James Rainey, Commanding General, Army Futures Command, and Major General Michelle Schmidt, the Director of Force Development, or Army G8. I welcome each of you and thank you for your service and your willingness to appear before us today. And as we meet to review the Department of the Army's investment and modernization strategy as presented in the fiscal year 2024 budget request, I want to acknowledge the work soldiers are doing all across the globe and express our gratitude to them and their families for the vital role that they play. Today's Army remains engaged in operations and training events worldwide that build confidence and interoperability with our allies and our partners, test and experiment with equipment to identify needs, capabilities, and present combat-credible forces to deter our competitors. Today, as Ukrainians battle to defend their homeland, thousands of U.S. soldiers remain deployed to the European continent to deter the expansion of Russian aggression. I had the occasion to meet many members of the 10th Mountain Division in Poland just last week. And these missions underscore both the complexity of contested logistics and the importance of our pre-positioned stocks. Operations in Ukraine also demonstrate how critical, effective, multi-domain operations are for a ground force, as well as the power that joint and coalition operations can have. They also provide a stark contrast to the complexities the joint force would face if compelled to conduct similar operations in a contested maritime theater. This is why the Army's focus on long-range fires, integrated air and missile defense, deep sensing, and contested logistics is critical to the current and the future force. And we look forward to hearing about lessons learned over the past year. And as we begin work on the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, we recognize that the Army continues to operate with a largely flat budget. At the same time, the Army is providing significant equipment and munitions in support of Ukraine. Mr. Bush, we've had occasion to discuss this work before, and today I would like to hear how the Army is using the replenishment of these items to build future modernization in concert with the organic industrial base modernization strategy, and your assessment of any additional risks the Army may be incurring and discussion of any additional resources or flexibilities that would further improve munitions development and production. In this budget submission, the Army continues to prioritize its signature modernization efforts while slowing procurement of enduring capabilities. This supports the current national defense strategy that I think accurately ranks China as the most consequential strategic competitor and the pacing challenge for the department. As you all know, China has been investing heavily in its military and in emerging technologies. And the best way to deter them is not to just keep pace on the cutting edge, but also to continue modernizing our forces to make clear to our adversaries that they cannot beat us on the battlefield. At the same time, Russia continues to demonstrate an aggressive posture, and operations in Europe remind us that enduring systems require modernization investments too. We would like to better understand how the Army is balancing risk between newer modernization priorities and supporting enduring programs. And we're interested in the specific investments and capabilities the Army included in the 24 budget requests that continue the implementation of the current NDS, including efforts across 6 modernization priorities, which are long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, the Army network, air and missile defense, soldier lethality and its rapid capabilities development efforts in hypersonics, directed energy, indirect fire protection, and mid-range capability. We appreciate the Army's employment of more flexible acquisition authorities and increased use of experimentation and soldier touch points to better define capabilities and requirements. The Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona has been a proud host for signature efforts like Project Convergence, which continues to guide modernization activity. These practices make more rapid fielding possible, and we applaud the Army's progress in this area and are interested in the Army's assessment of its current testing and training facilities, that capability and that capacity to support the modernization force. The broader organic industrial base also remains critical to the Army's overall modernization strategy. We would like to better understand how the Army is ensuring that it's identifying and maintaining critical industrial capacity. The Army is now faced with competing pressures on its structure, a significant shortfall in recruiting, and a generational modernization effort. For the purpose of this subcommittee, we are deeply interested in how the Army is determining the structure, ops concepts, and posture it requires to field these new capabilities and best meet the threat environment. Additionally, we must understand the impact of these decisions on the modernization of the Army National Guard and Army Reserves and critical components of the total Army. The Army continues to make significant progress in these efforts, but difficult decisions lie ahead. And I have great confidence in all of you and look forward to a productive year here as we work to continue to field the world's best Army. I'll now recognize our ranking member, Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying congratulations on your new role as Chairman of the Armed Services Subcommittee on Air and Land Power. I look forward to working with you. I had a productive working relationship with your predecessor, Senator Duckworth, and I know that we'll have one as well despite your suspect service in our Navy. I want to thank our witnesses for being here as well. The subcommittee meets to discuss the Army's modernization efforts with a focus on the fiscal year 2024 budget submission from President Biden. China is this nation's chief threat, even as we face continued threats from adversaries like Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others. Ensuring that we can prevail in any conflict with China will require a joint effort, and the U.S. Army will play a key role in any such conflict. Beginning in 2014, China undertook a force reorganization and modernization plan that has resulted in key advantages, including strategically located forces, mass, and magazine depth. If called upon to compete with this improved Chinese force, the U.S. Army will need to be modernized and ready to provide key capabilities such as command and control, logistics, and long-range precision fires. But I'm still concerned that the plan for the Army of 2030 and now General Rainey's plan for the Army of 2040 may be insufficient to produce the Army we need now and in the near term to counter China. For instance, Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has exposed severe weaknesses in the Army's industrial base as in the other services. I want to commend Assistant Secretary Bush for his yeoman's work in executing drawdown authorities and contracting new equipment in support of Ukraine. But the Army's World War II-era plants and depots cannot fully support the Army's munitions and equipment needs, and the industrial base continues to be undermanned and under-resourced. Mr. Bush notes in the Army Ammunition Plant Modernization Plan that, quote, several projects could be moved to the left if additional resourcing becomes available, end quote. The Army's unfunded priority list also includes funding for planning and design, as well as one project at Radford Army Ammo Plant. I look forward to hearing about these and other organic industrial base projects ready for funding in fiscal year 2024. For the past several years, the Army has focused its modernization efforts on 6 critical areas: long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicles, future vertical lift, network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. I'm most encouraged by the progress made in long-range precision fires, specifically the fiscal year 2024 budget support of the Precision Strike Missile, mid-range capability, and long-range hypersonic weapon. All 3 will play direct roles in any future conflict in the Western Pacific. But as Mr. Bush noted in a recent interview, important trades had to be made in crafting this year's budget. I believe the Biden administration did the Army a disservice by forcing it to make these trades. When adjusted for inflation, President Biden's budget proposes to cut the Army's funding by 2% compared to last year's enacted levels. As a result, the Army submitted almost $2 billion worth of unfunded priorities, including air defense, tanks, helicopters, military construction, and training. All of these priorities will help modernize the Army, and this subcommittee will look to include many of them in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. Again, I thank the witnesses and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Testifying today are the Honorable Doug Bush, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, and Army Acquisitions Executive; General Rainey, the Commanding General of the United States Army Futures Command; and Major General Michelle Schmidt, Director of Force Development, or G8. I know the witnesses together submitted a single joint statement, but I want to start with Secretary Bush for an individual statement, and then we'll go in that order.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Cotton, and distinguished members of the Senate Armed Services Committee on Air and Land, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you to discuss the Army Modernization Program and the resources requested in the President's budget for fiscal year 2024. I'm pleased to be joined by my teammates, General James Rainey, Army Futures Command, and Major General Michelle Schmidt from the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, G8. We appreciate your making our written statement a part of the record for today's hearing. With your support, the Army's fiscal year 2024 budget gives us the opportunity to maintain critical momentum across the board. The Army's budget request puts us on a sustainable path to equip today's soldiers with modern equipment while we invest in the technologies and systems necessary to build the Army of 2030. It represents our sustained commitment to our key modernization portfolios that both the distinguished chairman and ranking member outlined in their statements. It also continues modernization and procurement of our enduring platforms and equipment that will remain in the force for years to come. However, no budget proposal can be built without balancing risks, and this one is no different. I believe that this budget request reflects a thoughtful and balanced approach between developing future capabilities and modernizing our enduring systems. But at the end of the day, members of Congress will decide if we struck the appropriate balance, and I welcome that dialogue. In that spirit, I would like to address a few specific issues raised in the invitation for this hearing. First, the hearing invitation asked us to address how the Army's budget request supports requirements in the Indo-Pacific theater, including long-range fires, air and missile defense, and sensing capabilities. I can say with confidence that this year's budget request fully recognizes and funds the Army's role in the Pacific in these areas. As you look at the future year's defense program overall, you will see significant new investments in procurement dollars for the network, long-range fires, air and missile defense, and deep sensing, all vital to the Army's mission in the Indo-Pacific region. And critically, this shift from doing just R&D to actual procurement is a major step for the Army that gets us another step closer to fielding real capabilities to real soldiers, not just doing R&D. Second, the hearing invitation asked that we provide an update on the Army's efforts to expand critical munitions production, including opportunities to further expand production timelines, or reduce production timelines. As part of the Army's role in the overall U.S. government response to Ukraine, we are using the generous funding from Congress and every authority at our disposal, including those new ones we received in the FY23 NDAA, while working closely with our industry partners to dramatically increase production rates across the board. We have here a generational opportunity working with Congress to improve the quality and modernization of our organic industrial base, as well as making capital investments with our private sector industry partners to put the United States Army in a better place in the long term. Through your support, production rates in key areas such as munitions replenishment, they are on the rise, and we are able to address obsolescence issues with the machinery in our precision munitions manufacturing as well, critical to deterring China. Third, the hearing invitation requests an update on the Army's efforts to adapt experimentation and testing to support concept development and accelerate our modernization efforts. As highlighted in our written statement, the Army is modernizing our business practices by embracing industry best practices, such as the use of soldier-centered design and rigorous experimentation. General Rainey will elaborate further on the great work AFC is doing in this regard, specifically in the areas of Project Convergence and the Experimental Demonstration Gateway event, otherwise known as EDGE, and other efforts. Lastly, the hearing invitation asked how the Army is managing risk and modernizing enduring capabilities while concurrently prioritizing future programs. As members are aware, in order to protect the Army's highest priority modernizations efforts, the Army did accept some risk in other areas, and specifically the pace of modernization of our brigade combat teams, armored brigade combat teams, excuse me. However, in doing so, the Army sought to ensure that we didn't go so low on any system that we put the industrial base at risk to a degree that forecloses the ability of the Army to ramp back up if the Army's priorities change. In short, we sought to ensure we did not close off options for Army leaders or Congress to adjust our plans in the future if they judge that's the right thing to do. That is a careful balance to strike. I acknowledge we don't always get it exactly right. There are often differences of opinion with industry on the right balance between a production line being viable and fully productive. But I look forward to working with you and other members on this issue of where you think the Army got it right and where you think we got it wrong. A final issue I'd mention is the Army is fully utilizing the new acquisition authorities provided by Congress, such as the urgent need pathway, middle tier acquisition pathway, and software acquisition pathway to make the Army's acquisition system work much more quickly than in the past. In closing, I want to say thank you for both the funding and authorities we need to support our modernization efforts. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Bush. General Rainey.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Cotton, distinguished members of the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Air, Land, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to testify about how the Army's FY 2024 budget request supports the Army's comprehensive approach to modernization as we both deliver the Army of 2030 and design the Army of 2040. Army Futures Command is accountable for transformation or transforming the Army, and modernization is obviously an essential part of that important mission. I'm honored to be here with great teammates, the Honorable Mr. Bush and Major General Michelle Schmidt. I agree with Mr. Bush that Army modernization is on track. I think there's 4 primary reasons for that I would offer. The first is very strong teamwork. AFC works very closely with ASALT. I respect Mr. Bush. We have a very positive and professional working relationship, and I think that transcends both of our organizations and is critical to our success. Putting new equipment and weapons into soldiers' hands to increase lethality is what both of us work hard on every day. Teamwork also includes integrating efforts across the whole Army, so Training and Doctrine Command, Army Material Command, FORCECOM, our service component commanders, so working closely with General Flynn and General Williams, who are out on the edge in Europe and Indo-PACOM, are critical partners. And then because we don't fight as an Army, we fight as a joint force, our teamwork with the rest of the joint force has been very positive and is contributing to our success. The second thing is consistency. We've gone on 5 years now where the Army has stuck with the modernization priorities as previously discussed, and that consistency is translating into success. The third one is organizational changes. 5 years ago, to get after those 6 priorities, the Army came up with the idea of cross-functional teams that have been one of the absolute success stories of the adjustments, not just of AFC, of the way the Army's adjusted and sustaining those. We are capitalizing on that success by adding, as we announced recently, a new contested logistics CFT to get after what is absolutely one of the things we have to address as we modernize the Army. Fourth is our commitment to continuous learning. As asked in the invitation, Project Convergence is the Army's campaign of persistent experimentation. So not a one-time event, but a campaign of persistent experimentation. Project Convergence includes linked learning events throughout the year that inform each other. For example, Balakatan, an annual bilateral exercise, is underway now in the Philippines, and we have AFC teammates and analysts participating with General Flynn in that critical experiment. An experimental demonstration gateway event, also known as EDGE, is scheduled to take place next month, 1 through 19 May, at Yuma Proving Grounds, and I'd be glad to talk more about that. All of these things work together to deliver the speed, range, and convergence our Army needs as part of the joint force to ensure overmatch against our adversaries. Material modernization is absolutely essential part of transforming our Army to ensure war-winning future readiness. Transforming turns material modernization into true warfighting capability and lethality. It makes sure that we are the dominant land force in the world now, in 2030, in 2040, and every point in between. And transformation means thinking in terms of formations, not just platforms. We buy things, but we fight formations. It's absolutely essential that we modernize our equipment in a holistic way, but also address organizational changes, continue to develop our people and develop our leaders, create the training capacity for that equipment, make sure we have facilities that enable us to utilize that equipment. And transforming means thinking it further out in the future also, out to 2040 and beyond. So we're reaching out to the best experts we can find to think with us about the future of warfare as we define the future operational environment, develop future concepts, and experiment aggressively. We need to approach 2040 with a sense of urgency now over the next 18 to 24 months. Transforming the Army to ensure war-winning future readiness and doing that persistently and urgently is the best guarantee that our successful material modernization efforts will produce lethal formations that can dominate the land domain. Thank you for your support to the soldiers and civilians of our organizations and the Army. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. General Schmidt.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Cotton, and the distinguished members of the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Airland for the opportunity to appear and testify regarding the Army's fiscal year 24 modernization efforts. A special thank you to all committee members for your enduring support of our soldiers, civilians, and our families as they continue to play such a vital role in the defense of our nation. I'm honored to be here today with Honorable Bush and General Rainey, who are both incredible professionals and leaders. Our modernization budget request for fiscal year 24 reflects our multi-year effort to accelerate, focus modernization, and place transformational capabilities into the hands of our soldiers. Our single focus is to make our soldiers and units more lethal to fight and win our nation's wars. And these investments will assist with building enduring advantages over our nation's adversaries, whether in the Indo-Pacific or European theaters or wherever threats may arise. And the transformation you are assisting us with is being brought to bear. We must modernize responsibly, maintaining readiness now, while transforming at a pace informed by available resources. Several years of difficult prioritization, eliminating, reducing, and deferring lower priority and less necessary modernization efforts, as well as divesting legacy capabilities, affords little flexibility in our budget top line. So every decision we make now is a difficult one. These are hard choices, tough choices about the pace of modernization and the balance we must achieve in integrating new capabilities while maintaining our ability to deter and respond to crisis. As such, we ask for your continued support to maintain a sustainable modernization path for the Army. In closing, I'd like to thank your staffs and all those who professionally facilitate the engagement necessary to advance our shared commitment to the defense of our nation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and I'll start by recognizing myself here for 5 minutes. And let me start with General Rainey. You mentioned cross-functional teams in your opening statement, and I understand that the maturity of efforts in the original Army's Futures Command cross-functional teams, your focus, as you mentioned, shifting to the Army of 2040, and you're considering adding, and you mentioned new cross-functional teams that tackle additional challenges like contested logistics. So can you please describe in more detail to the committee how you're shifting AFC's focus and what requirements you may be considering for a cross-functional team on this specific issue of contested logistics?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman. I appreciate that question. If I may, when I talk about 2030 and 2040, so I don't want to create the impression that I'm shifting away from 2030 to 2040. To be clear, Army modernization is going well. We need to stay laser focused on delivering on the modernization efforts we have going and start thinking about the opportunities to outthink and get ahead of our adversaries as we start thinking about what's going to change in this like second and third FIDEP, so that time period, but not at the expense of staying focused on delivering on our current efforts. The Contested Logistics CFT, working in partnership with Army Material Command, who does the strategic and operational levels. So the CFT initial operating capability, our chief and secretary approved the stand-up, so they've already started with a small team. They'll be fully operational, I would say, by about 1 October of this year. And they're going to focus at the tactical level of contested logistics. To specifically answer your question, predictive logistics, the technology is absolutely exists today for us to do a better job of understanding what the logistics requirements, because one of the key ways to reduce our logistics burden is to be more precise. So we can't afford to push stuff just to push it. We need to know what the maintenance status, fuel status, and ammo status of our combat systems are. Autonomous and robotic distribution. So how can we leverage technology to minimize the amount of humans we're putting at risk to deliver logistics and sustainment? Demand reduction. Hybrid electric, for example, that can start by lowering the amount of fuel we require forward. Tactical power generation as we become more and more technology focused, and for all the great things that brings you, it also creates an increased demand in terms of battery, which especially at the most important level of the Army, the rifle squads, the soldiers who are walking and carrying everything they have, every pound matters. So I think there's opportunities there.
General, does that mean the ability to generate power forward or carry more dense batteries?
Chairman, I think the opportunity of a CFT, the way it's been successful is to clearly identify a problem, put together the right talent from across the organizations, and let them develop those things. So I wouldn't want to rule out any possibilities, but to reduce the amount of energy consumed forward and reduce the weight on the soldier would be two of the things that they would start out pursuing.
Are you looking at any artificial intelligence decision-making in the logistics decisions?
There are opportunities. We are employing AI and machine learning now to manage the massive amounts of data and analyze it. So predictive logistics has an opportunity. Well, now it's an opportunity to use AI to analyze the amount of data, the opportunity to get into aided decision-making in terms of predictive logistics. I have not seen that yet, but would not rule that out.
I had dinner with the 5th Corps commander last Thursday night in Poland. And, you know, this is an area where we do really well, logistics, and he was stressing just how critical it is for any large-scale Army operation, is we've got to get the logistics right. And I've got more questions about this for Secretary Bush when it comes back to me, but for now, let me recognize Senator Cotton.
Thank you. Mr. Bush, I want to return to what I said in my opening statement and commend you for your work to try to accelerate timelines for production of munitions. I know you and a lot of others have really been rolling up your sleeves and working long hours, but I think you'd agree that we're still not producing enough of what we need fast enough. That's both in our Army ammunition plants and the industrial base. I've dug into the tables behind the budget request. It's a shocking timeline, really, in some of these cases. Basic munitions, not ones that are complicated or advanced, like artillery shells, can take up to 2 to 3 years to produce. Can you just give us a general sense of why that is? I mean, we built the Pentagon in less time than it takes to make basic artillery shells today. So what's up with that?
So, Senator, the actual time, I believe the timelines reflected in the formal budget documents are, I guess I would say those are the traditional timelines that assume a lengthy contracting process, followed by, a staggered, sometimes slow on purpose to maintain level workload at the factory approach. So for conventional munitions, I can tell you that artillery shells, for example, it takes about a month to get the steel. Now there's always a flow of steel, but about a month to get the steel. That steel is only at Scranton Army Ammunition Plant for about 3 days. Then it goes to Iowa Army Ammunition Plant for load assemble pack, which also only takes about a week. So when we're going as fast as we can, like we are right now, those timelines can be faster. However, sir, right now, as you mentioned, the issue is capacity, not timeline. On precision munitions, your point is very well taken and still very much the case. So advanced munitions, Patriots, sometimes even Gimlers, things with seekers or advanced electronics, we are still, sir, in those, at times, 1 to 2 year timelines, but trying to go faster right now.
So thank you for that, and I probably want to continue that distinction. And another distinction I want to drill down on is what you said about contracting processes or timelines. I view those as bureaucratic constraints. Those are Gordian knots. I think, in my opinion, Gordian knots exist to be cut. In many cases, a sword, or at least as Congress, can be the sword. Then there's actual real-world constraints on the availability of certain inputs, whether it's steel, energetics, chips, what have you. Let's focus on that area first. What are the single worst bottlenecks we face in the real world constraints about these munitions? Because again, we're not talking about an aircraft carrier or stealth fighter. We're talking about in what are most cases are man-portable munitions. But what are the concrete real world bottlenecks that the Army is facing right now?
Yes, sir. So I think if we're talking about precision munitions, often it is the sensitive electronic components, so computer chips and everything behind them that leads to some of those timelines. So if you trace back to the original sources, that's where some of that comes from. Also, of course, our systems do have sophisticated systems to make them safer than what the Russians might produce or exportable. That also adds time. But most often it is the electronic components that take the most time, probably followed by solid rocket motors for a lot of our munitions that are rockets or missiles. The other elements, or explosives and such, really are the shorter poles in the tent.
Okay. And what are the best ways this committee and this Congress can provide the Army with ways to reduce those timelines, to open up those bottlenecks?
Yes, sir. So first of all, the most economically efficient way to make a production line better is to buy more. So that way you let the market do its thing, and it downstream suppliers get better. It helps the whole system. So that's number one. And thank you for your support on all of that. Number two, and thank you for the support last year, is multi-year techniques like multi-year procurement and advanced procurement. I think when we testified last year, we were exploring the ideas of doing those things for munitions. They hadn't been done before. We're doing them now. And making that normal, not an exception, will be vital, sir. So we have to get that right. One other leg in the stool would be, over time, working on continued, for example, Defense Production Act investments. So that is the tool the department has to go way down in the supply chain and directly invest in companies, often small ones at the third and fourth tier. Congress provided very generous additional DPA Title III funding last year. I think we're putting it to great work. I think we did it in the Cold War at a much larger scale, and I think that's a model for how, with the right authorities and the right money in the right place, we can be better prepared next time, sir. So
to be clear on that, you're not talking about up here at the primes or assembling things, but at the subcontractor or maybe even the subcontractor doing fairly kind of basic inputs, let's call them valves or gaskets or what have you, reaching down to that level with DPA authorities.
Yes, sir, and that's a big difference with DPA. So really, our normal input is at the top with the prime, and you hope that funding flows down and goodness of a production line gets down to those suppliers. DPA lets us go directly at some of those subs, which are often actually the most weak points. It's not the bigs. It's the sub-tier contractors.
Yeah, and oftentimes those subcontractors, 1 or 2 levels down, are providing those inputs for multiple primes or multiple different weapon systems, so there's a bottleneck there as well, right?
Yes, sir. In many cases, and we've got this now, I think we've got much better handle on mapping our own supply chains from the government side. We see those overlaps that industry might not see because they're looking at their supply chain, not the national supply chains.
One final question about inputs, drawing from a partner. Are you aware of NAMO's challenges in expanding in central Norway?
Not specifically, sir.
Their CEO said a couple of weeks ago that they would like to expand. Obviously, they're producing a lot of munitions that are in very high demand in Ukraine, but there is no electricity available in central Norway because all of the excess capacity is going to power servers for TikTok videos. He said they literally can't make more munition shells because of cat videos. Are you aware of any constraints on either our Army ammunition plants or in the defense industrial base because of electricity or other power inputs?
I'm not, sir. I believe we have other challenges. Some of I've mentioned and others, but I've definitely not heard that one. Not in the United States.
The NAMO CEO said he wouldn't have even put it past TikTok and the Chinese to specifically have cited their cat videos next to NAMO's production facility in central Norway. All right, I have more specific questions I'll save for a second round.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Rainey, on several occasions, this committee has expressed concerns about how the Department of Defense is tasked and organized to support electronic warfare operations in support of the Joint Force or newly established multi-domain task forces. And although both cyber and electronic warfare personnel are attached to the Army Cyber Branch, electronic warfare lacks a designated entity for cross-cutting electronic warfare attack, for sensing, and protection across all Army formations and echelons. So my question for you, sir, is can you outline what entity will own the manning, training, equipping, budgeting, and capability deployment for electronic warfare operations in the Army?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I can. Major General Paul Stanton is the commander of the Cyber Center of Excellence and is responsible for the fourth generation of electronic warfare forces. And General Barrett is the Army Cyber Command, who's the operational commander, who's the senior cyber and electronic warfare officer we have. If I may, because I share your interest, one, it's something we've been working on as part of the Army 2030. The importance of electronic warfare is blindingly obvious if you're an observer of what's going on in Ukraine right now. So it's going to become more and more important as we go forward. The Army modernization efforts address that, so we're adding new capabilities at every echelon. So technology-wise, the T-list brigade combat team capability, there is an acknowledgement that we need to put the ability to sense and strike into our most forward formations. And we're working that at a higher echelon. Also, organizationally, the Army is adding intelligence and electronic warfare battalions back into our divisions, or at least our Army 2030 priority modernization efforts. So those are a couple examples. Theater information advantage groups, the multi-domain task force have a dedicated electronic warfare capability, both in humans and technology built into them. So absolutely critical, something we need to keep working on, but I believe it's a matter of delivering and following through on our plans.
Right, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for that deeper dive. General Schmidt, outside of JRTC and NTC, do you believe the Army would benefit from having training locations with standing approvals from the necessary DOD and non-DOD bodies to conduct electronic warfare operations during large-scale combat operation training exercises?
Senator, thank you. I think our Army is the best Army in the world because we're committed to training as we fight. And so we try to replicate an operational environment, a realistic operational environment wherever we can. That said, I know there are some challenges in conducting electronic warfare operations in areas outside of the few designated areas, and welcome your support in overcoming some of those challenges. If I may, General Rainey, sir, would you have more to offer on that one?
Well, thank you, Michelle. We absolutely need to continue to add the capability to train with multi-domain capabilities that keeps up with both the pace of war and the capabilities that we're adding. Right. So it would be tragic if all our material modernization center resulted in real equipment showing up in formations that we couldn't then train with. Right. So there are some clear challenges. I would love the opportunity to follow up and brief you in great detail on this, but some examples. If you think about what the National Training Center did standing that up and how that translated into the Army of Desert Storm timeframe, that same opportunity is presenting us. So we're adding electronic warfare and multi-domain training capabilities to both Polk and Fort Irwin, but there's other great opportunities. The Fox training range at Fort Huachuca is uniquely postured to get in there and do things with authorities, populations, and then we're probably going to need help from the entire government because the FCC, FCA, there's some authorities and challenges that have to work their way up through the Joint Staff to OSD, obviously, but I think we should be pursuing expanded capabilities very aggressively.
Well, I appreciate that from both of you. We have some ideas about how to do that in some locations, so if we could follow up with you offline and talk about that, because I agree this is absolutely essential, and there are a limited number of places where you can do it, and there are some places where I think in my home state too, where we can expand some of this. We'd love to have that conversation with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ernst.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bush, and General, thank you for being here. So we've witnessed the last year, the war in Ukraine, and it has just made it extremely clear that we need a responsive munitions industrial base. And Mr. Bush, we've talked this a number of times, and I do commend the Army's investment in the Iowa Army ammunition plant and other munitions enterprises. So thank you very much for that. We know that this is a critical down payment for the future needs of our Army. There's still an acute vulnerability, though, that exists out there in the munitions industrial base, and something that the ranking member addressed just a bit ago, and that's our energetics. And these are the chemicals that are critical for our explosives and propellants, and yet our supply chain for energetics is decades old. And we have limited suppliers for energetics, and they've created some very vulnerable points in our industrial base. And so we all know that if we can't sustain this for our future fight, we're going to lose. We're going to lose. So, General Rainey, would you agree that advanced energetics like CL-20 can provide improved munition range, lethality, and size? And would this help U.S. forces in long-range salvo exchanges against our peer militaries? Or Mr. Bush, whoever would like to take that one. Thank you.
Senator, yes, if I could, please. So the CL-20 issue, I am aware of some recent thoughtful articles and some studies that have highlighted that potential of using that different formulation to get improved range, for example, out of the same size rockets and missiles. When I asked my experts at Picatinny, they are doing research on that. I think it's really, the questions come down to safety standards and handling. We have very high standards for that, probably the highest in the world. But I think my first contact with them on that issue, they said that where in the past it was kind of ruled out that there might be additional potential. So, ma'am, that could be an area of some additional R&D focus, could certainly potentially pay dividends for that or something else like that.
Okay, no, that's important, that we don't completely rule it out, but we continue to research that, so I appreciate that. And then, Mr. Bush, as well, what is the state of energetic supply chain? Where are those risks? Where are the vulnerabilities? And how can we shore that up?
Yes, Senator, I think when we do our I've seen that our first pass of supply chains, what you often see is kind of what the most economical version of that supply chain is. So you often go to lowest price suppliers, which are often in countries, some of which we really don't want to be dependent on. I think we are taking a more fulsome look at that. I think we're seeing that we need not just suppliers in the right countries, so friendshoring, or if it's not in the United States, which is ideal, but if it's like perhaps a neighboring country or a strong ally, and we need more than one for everything. And critically, we have to spend the money in advance to qualify those sources so that when we need to ramp up, and this is advanced planning for a surge, you already have a qualified vendor, meaning all the safety and other standards have been addressed to make sure that we get what we pay for. We are doing that now, but one of my lessons learned from this munitions expansion is that that kind of work needs to be done in advance and coordinated with allies who have a lot of the capability that we can also draw on, and so it's not just us doing it, but using the whole Western world to do this together.
Absolutely. And as we look towards the fight in Ukraine, obviously what we do at the Iowa Army Ammunition Plant is very important. If we look at other fights that may occur around the globe, it may take different types of munitions. So as we're in the planning with that, we want to know how we can be very helpful there, because we need to be able to sustain peacetime, but then also be able to surge for any future fight we might have. So thank you. Mr. Bush, would you agree that enterprise-level coordination would reduce risk in the energetics industrial base?
Senator, I want to say yes, just enterprise between
Different
the
industry.
department. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I think definitely a Department of Defense approach would be more efficient than the services doing it themselves, because we wouldn't want to step on each other. For example, we often go back, us, the Navy's buying missiles, we're buying missiles. We don't want to step on each other's toes. And then certainly there are avenues for cooperation through, for example, industry consortiums, where you are able to get in the room and really share information with the government and among the suppliers that could pay benefits. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, appreciate that very much. And thanks for the great work. Really do appreciate it. I know with Ukraine and all the discussions that we have had, both in open and closed sessions, has been extremely helpful to identifying where some of our vulnerabilities are and where they exist. So thanks. Really appreciate your input. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. I'll now take another 5 minutes here. So back to the contested logistics, Secretary Bush. The Secretary of the Army describes the Army's role in the Pacific in part to sustain the joint force over vast distances by providing secure communications, establishing an inter-theater distribution network or networks, maintaining munitions stockpiles in theater, as well as forward arming and refueling points in the Western Pacific. And this all gets to the importance of contested logistics. I saw, not the contested part, but I saw the great job in Rzeszów, Poland, that the Army is doing in getting the equipment needed for the fight in Ukraine to the border, essentially. Uncontested, but contested is much more challenging. Orders of magnitude more challenging situation. So how does the fiscal year 24 budget invest in this Army contested logistic capabilities? Secretary Bush.
Yes, Senator. So I think we did start in 24 moving the dial on logistics investments. So a couple areas I'd mentioned. There is more funding than I think if you compare to 23 for maintaining our watercraft fleet, at least keeping it viable, but also starting in 24 production of one of our first new vessels, the Maneuver Support Vessel Light, in many, many years that will replace some very old platforms. So that's one. We also put more funding back into things like just trucks and wheeled vehicles. So the Army has that Title 10 role, as you mentioned. That logistics force is vast and requires up-to-date equipment. So we put more funding back there. And also ammunition stocks, conventional ammunition stockpiles, was a third area of investment. So, sir, I think how that, though, works in a Pacific context is where you get into the transport legs, the communications networks. General Rainey mentioned having predictive logistics and more accurate logistics, and also just needing less. So demand reduction, be it ammunition or fuel, the more efficient platforms we have, that is part of solving a contested logistics problem.
Mr. Secretary, even though it's obviously a different Army, different operations, different tactics, I mean, the needing less is not a scenario that is played out, well in Ukraine. So are there any lessons that were taken from operations in Europe right now? How does that affect our thought here on getting to the point where we could potentially need less ammo? Because right now we're seeing in the first major land conflict in Europe that it's exactly the opposite.
Senator, if I could start and then ask General Rainey to provide his thoughts, if that's okay. First off, I think the U.S. Army, when we fight, we tend to fight with a lot of precision. We also have our joint force providing a lot of fires from the air, again with precision. Ukraine doesn't have that. So for the large part, they're fighting differently than we would. Does not mean it's not a concern. And sir, by needing less, I think I was speaking simply at the individual platform level, which would make us more efficient with the same logistics flow. You could sustain more forces if they were more efficient. I didn't mean to suggest that, that overall wars tend to always, as you note, require vastly more resources than we think. And beyond that, if I could have General Rainey talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Mr. Bush, and thank you, Senator. What we're observing is obviously horrific, what's going on in Ukraine right now, but from a military standpoint, we're observing attrition warfare. Two armies frontally assaulting and using attrition as opposed to maneuver warfare, which is the strength of the United States Joint Force. You know, our real asymmetric superpowers are people. A close second to that is the fact that we practice maneuver warfare, joint warfare, that is underpinned by really disciplined and tough training, which is why things like being able to train on these capabilities, like General Schmidt said, is just as important as having the capabilities. In terms of contested logistics, the two biggest opportunities for our Army as we modernize is to increase the lethality and survivability of our light formations. So we have very deployable formations. They just have a problem with things like protection from counter UAS and the lethality. So we have tanks to kill tanks, but the technology absolutely exists, as we've seen, to kill tanks with Javelin missiles, for example. So increase the lethality and survivability of our light formations and do things to drive down the weight and the logistics tail of our heavy formations. So pursuing those, and I can give you several examples of how our modernization efforts do that if you're interested. Silent drive and silent watch, for example, is the hybrid technology that lets our tanks not become dependent on electricity, but it makes a better tank because it can be silent, and both when it's standing still and limited approach. And those kind of requirements as we modernize our vehicles is an opportunity to reduce our log tail and improve the lethality of our formations.
Well, thank you. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Bush, I want to return to one more question about our opening conversation of the munitions issue at a high level. You stressed demand and how high demand could help keep the lines going, keep people employed in their high-skilled, specialized functions. I assume that means demand not just from our military, but also ally and partner military as well, right?
Yes, sir. Ideally, we don't have to provide all that demand. So it's very encouraging in that light that many countries in Europe in particular are now committing to spending more and buying some of our equipment. That is enormously helpful to keeping healthy production lines.
So it's good. It's not just good from a military standpoint that we have friends in Europe and the Middle East and the Western Pacific who wanted to buy more of our munitions, but it's also good for our workers and our companies here in the United States.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you. Now I want to get a little more specific. The budget request includes investments to support prototyping for the long-range hypersonic missile, flight tests for the mid-range capability missile, and initial fielding of the precision strike missile, or PrSM. As PrSM is one of the key long-range fire capabilities necessary and will be vital in a Pacific conflict. I just want to dig a little bit deeper on this. The Army is requesting $273 million to work on future increments of PrSM, $384 million for 110 increment 1 missiles. But I suspect that's likely inadequate for the need. What are the plans to expand production capacity of the PrSM increment 1 beyond 110 missiles per year?
So, Senator, I think that initial number reflects mostly the fact that it's a new missile. We are just ramping into production and transitioning away from ATACMS production to PrSM. I think to the degree we can, I know there was great support inside the department for this capability. So I think there's an opportunity there for expanded production, assuming current initial testing goes well. On the R&D for increment 2 and increment 4, these are improved future versions. Production for those is still a few years out, but if we set conditions right with a healthy production line for increment 1, that'll put us in a better place.
Can you say a little more about your plan for both increment 2 and especially increment 4?
Yes, sir. So increment 2, we hope to be able to give us a anti-ship capability that would provide anti-ship capability out of a HIMARS launcher at significant range. Increment 4, we hope, could more than double the range of increment 1. That will require a new propulsion system, but the science and technology is underway on that. Again, all launched out of a HIMARS, which has proven highly successful in Ukraine, very difficult to locate, easy to move around. This would be a dramatic increase in the Army's ability to create problems for a potential fight with China, for example, because we could station those everywhere.
Okay. What's the prospect for multi-year procurement for PRISM, as you've done for PAC-3 and GMLRS?
So, Senator, as soon as we have that production line up and running and the cost is well understood on increment 1, I think it could be a very good candidate for a multi-year approach.
Okay. I also understand from your testimony and statement that the operational evaluation of the extended range cannon has revealed some engineering problems. Would you please say a little bit more about those challenges and about the Army's progress on the cannon?
Yes, sir. So the extended range cannon program, I think we have been on a very aggressive timeline. We have built 7 or 8 prototypes, and we took them immediately into full testing. That testing has revealed challenges. I would say there are more engineering and mechanical challenges, but still there they are. While disappointing, I think it is good that we found them now before we went into a full production for this system, for example. We are still doing testing. I believe we will know more over the summer about the degree of the challenge and the extent to which we need to adjust our budget request this year and in future years, and look at the portfolio overall and see where that capability fits in terms of just overall improvement in Army range for cannon systems. I would mention there's great R&D work going on, for example, on new munitions that can also provide very long range out of existing cannons. So a mix of those two approaches might be warranted.
Okay.
Thank you. So, General, I want to move on to a little bit of a different topic here, which is, testing critical capabilities. And General Rainey, I'm concerned that our ability, to test certain capabilities ranging from things like electronic warfare to directed energy to hypersonics are constrained by some current limitations that we have to conduct like open air as well as hardware in the loop and simulated tests, environments, and experimentation, but also, real world, testing. I come from a flight test, background for a number of years. We have some facilities around the country, some really good ones happen to be in Arizona. The Electronic Proving Ground at Fort Huachuca, the Yuma Proving Ground. I think both of these facilities are crucial to the Army's efforts. So General Rainey, can you explain how the Army is ensuring that it has sufficient capacity and capability to proceed on its modernization requirements at the pace that our national defense strategy demands?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And to just acknowledge the point there, the ability to test is absolutely critical. We currently are not, that's not the pacing item. We currently aren't waiting for the ability to test on any modernization efforts, but as we continue to make progress, we've identified that as a potential, and that's why we are continuing to invest heavily in places like Yuma and Fort Huachuca and Camp Greeling and other places. So what we can't afford to do from the modernization and transformation standpoint would be to continue to pay for test capability and pay for training capability as separate things. So one of the very positive initiatives the Army has is to bring those test and training capabilities together, so to make sure we don't ask for resources, use it in a test, and then let it go to waste. We need to use it for tests and then be able to train. And that's why a place like the Fox Training Complex that gives you the ability to both test effectively and train effectively is one of our priorities.
So at the same facility, I think Fort Huachuca especially, when we, look at issues we have that we're facing with electronic warfare, and it offers a very unique geography, let's say, to be able to transmit at relatively high power level without disrupting, populations. I don't think we do a lot of training there yet. My understanding is I think we might do more in the Yuma area, but I agree with you that the more we can, integrate those, two facilities into one, it would certainly make sense to me. And in the Navy and the Air Force, we traditionally haven't done that. So maybe more recently we have, but like the Pax River, Naval Air Station is really about, developmental tests. Edwards Air Force Base, the same for the Air Force. So it's good to see the Army is doing this. Beyond that, like, how do you leverage, the full capacity of an installation? I have found, as I've traveled down to Fort Huachuca and down to Yuma Proving Ground, they often have the rain. Well, what they tend to be missing is like an investment in the test infrastructure. It might be theodolites, it might be, other equipment to gather data. And I think we often under-invest in those systems. Is that your sense, General?
On the specifics of our investment in that, I'll defer to the Honorable Bush, but to your point about how do you optimize them, another thing is using all the tools you have, so live, virtual, and constructed, and having the ability to link those capabilities. So linking someplace like Yuma to the National Training Center, to Camp Pendleton, which is something that we do during Project Convergence and need to continue to do that to find efficiencies. To your point about the joint, we need to not just be able to do that in the Army, but we need to be able to train together, experiment together as a joint force, and that's one of the main efforts of the persistent experimentation we have in Project Convergence. You'll see a lot of that, hopefully, if you can come visit us at Edge when we do it's the biggest annual aviation experiment we do out at Yuma next month.
If we have more time, I'd like to talk about Edge, maybe at the end of the hearing. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Bush, again, want to go back to the defense industrial base question. For the past few years, Congress has shown a willingness to fund and accelerate needed projects for the Army's organic industrial base. To that end, what projects within the Army ammunition plant modernization plan could be accelerated if Congress provides you with the necessary funding? And could you also explain how these projects would prepare the Army for conflict with China?
Yes, sir. So I think the great work done by my predecessor and General Daly at AMC was to develop a 15-year plan. And at the time, some questioned us, like, why have a 15-year plan? Well, sure enough, all of a sudden there were more resources. And we had a plan with shovel-ready projects ready to go. We still have that. So, sir, you mentioned one, I think it's in the UPA list, that certainly would be a strong candidate for Radford. There are others, and we can provide a detailed list, 1 to N, up to perhaps 10 or 15 projects as a follow-up if I could. There is a limit of absorption at some places because we, of course, have to keep these plants running while we're modernizing them. So you can't just shut the whole place down and modernize it. We're bumping up against that in a couple places, but I think we've found that there's always more work that can be done. And there's two types of projects. Some are really directly tied to increasing production capacity or automating systems or modernizing with regard to safety. Those are the ones that usually get the most attention. Others, though, that are equally as important is those long-term investments in the infrastructure of these places. So security, cyber investments, more resilient electricity generation on site, better roads. Those things matter too, sir. So I think we are open to a dialogue and a detailed level of what projects could be accelerated where, based on what members might have in mind.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about how to make these things. Let's talk about now where to put them and how we'd use them. General Rainey, could you talk a little bit about how pre-positioned stocks could support the Army's role in the Western Pacific, to include the possibility of pre-positioned stocks afloat?
Senator, thank you very much. So it gets to both the priority of the Indo-Pacific, the long lines of communication, and contested logistics. So absolutely, the preposition has kind of like a deferred term. So whether you're talking about APS traditionally, but absolutely the ability to position supplies forward in theater and Indo-PACOM, I fully agree that that is something we need to be doing. I know General Flynn is pursuing that aggressively as the Army commander out in the Pacific. If you look at one of the observations and lessons from Ukraine, I think, is if you look at how fast we were able as a country to react and support Ukraine, it was underpinned by a lot of things, one of which was the amount of capability that we already had, forward position, the partnerships we had, the training capabilities that we had in Europe at 7th ATC, and the relationships we had with partners. So replicating that in the priority theater, I fully support and agree with, sir.
And what about the prospects specifically of floating pre-positioned stock?
There's a business case, and ships at sea with a lot of stuff on them have some risks associated with it, but I would defer to Mr. Bush on that.
So, sir, we have our APS 3 set, which is our current one afloat set. We did have to add funding for it in '24 just to maintain it due to some increased costs, for example, on ship leases. But that's a vital capability, and the Army is committed to maintaining it. Expansion of APS 4 beyond where it is today heavily relies on really work of the State Department and others on getting access to these countries so we can build the locations. There's anywhere in the Philippines, Australia, other Southeast Asian locations would be things that the Army, I know, has looked at and planned against. I believe the department's working through getting to good so we can start that process. I can tell you in our current, of course, we're working on fiscal year '25 already, how to expand APS 4 is a critical issue the Army's still working through.
If they're not floating, they have to be on land somewhere, as you just alluded to. Just tell us in plain language, like what's the plan or the concept for preventing China from blowing all that stuff up in the early stages of a conflict?
Yes, Senator. So the ability to position anything gets to the one thing that's an even bigger problem than contested logistics, and that's the ability to protect anything you forward position. And there's a kinetic aspect, so air and missile defense and integrated, that's never going to be the total solution. So utilizing concealment, deception. One of the advantages of land-based capabilities, whether it be sustainment or long-range fires, is they're more agile and able to move them. So good tactics and fighting. We're not going to be able to put anything in range and assume it's going to stay safe unless we fight to keep it safe. So it's a balancing act. How much you go forward, you better be able to protect it, and we're pursuing those efforts.
You just touched indirectly, so I'll ask you directly about something I sometimes hear from other senators who are on the committee or just normal Arkansans who wonder about it. It's like, if we're going to be fighting China one day, isn't it going to be all out in the sea and in the air? The Army is fighting on the ground, so what's the Army going to be up to out in the Western Pacific? Why does the Army need to worry about that? So could you just, here in public, explain in plain language what the Army has to do with a fight that, if you just look at the map, appears to be all on water and in the air?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I'll try and do that. We fight as a joint force, so there's not such a thing as an air maritime theater, or any more than there's such a thing as a land theater. So the strength of the joint force is everybody brings their capabilities to bear. More specifically, the Army, as our Secretary said, has several responsibilities to enable the joint force. So command and control are Title X responsibilities for both protection and sustained logistics. But we're absolutely going to be able to, and need to, control land, whether it's to position Air Force assets to support the Navy's operations where they have to come and touch land, to secure ammunition sustainment. So there's absolutely a role. We're going to always need the ability, number one, to deter them first, because this is a war we don't want to have, and that's underpinned by them believing that they would lose in a ground war with us. And if we do transition to conflict, we're going to have to be able to take land away from the enemy. And if they defend it, that means taking it the old-fashioned way by killing them, and secure it and protect the joint force. So there's absolutely a role for our Army and every other service in what would be a horrific war.
Thank you.
Follow up on something Senator Cotton said about China blowing the stuff up. So if we forward position things as we should, and have the munitions, the fuel, the equipment, forward deployed, at some point in a conflict, we might need to be moving fuel, munitions, equipment across, say, thousands of miles of ocean. I want to see what your thought is about our ability to do that. I mean, it's not specifically the job of the United States Army, but it's your stuff. And right now, today, we have in our merchant marine about 85 ocean-going merchant vessels. This is beyond what Military Sea Lift Command has. And China has 5,500. Are you concerned about the ability in a conflict after it starts, about a logistics chain that goes across the Pacific Ocean, and our ability to sustain that?
Yes, Senator. I think everybody in the joint force is very concerned about that. I mean, you're talking the longest lines of communication that you can possibly imagine, and then fighting a really good enemy at the end of those. General Flynn is doing a lot of work, I know, to shorten those lines of communications by improving the pre-positioning of assets like we just previously discussed. But no, we're going to have to fight for that, and there's challenges. It'll be contested at sea, and I am aware of the limitations of the merchant marine, but not an expert on it. But it's going to be a challenge, and we're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to protect it.
I want to turn back in the last 3 minutes here before I turn it back over to Senator Cotton about back over to Europe. So I was in Poland, went to Kyiv, met with President Zelensky, spent over an hour with him talking about a lot of the challenges he's faced, some of the lessons learned, met with his national security team. There are a lot of lessons coming from this conflict, lessons that they're learning, lessons I think that we should be learning as well. So, General, from what you've been briefed on so far, what have the operations in Ukraine exposed about? First, let's start first about the value of heavy ground forces and how they're being deployed in Europe.
Thank you. The observations from one, I'm very proud of the Army and the Joint Force. We had our dedicated collection and lesson learned teams in place before the Russians even invaded. General Brito, the TRADOC commander, and we have numerous efforts ongoing. We take it very seriously. We have at my level, chief of staff at the level, weekly conversations to pay attention and make sure we're learning everything we can from this tragedy. There's some things that haven't changed dramatically, if I may start there. The importance of humans, that the war is fundamentally still a contest of will between humans, and you seeing the value of people fighting for something they believe in, and inspirational leadership, and the impacts of those, so some things don't change a lot about the nature of war, the importance of land. I think armored formations are absolutely relevant now and any point in the future, but specifically now, both, we're providing, the Ukrainians are asking for them, the Russians are trying to sustain them. The increasing lethality of the war, especially the HE, artillery, precision stuff matters and is really fascinating, but HE artillery is still the #1 killer, and you have to be able to protect your soldiers, and that space would be another example. Urban warfare, right? Everybody knows it's not what, nobody wants to do it. It's the worst kind of attrition. It's the hardest thing, but it is unavoidable when the people move to the cities and urban areas. sit astride your lines of communication where you're going to have to fight in urban areas. And it is impossible to do that without the ability to penetrate them. And you can't do that unless you have mobile protected firepower to do that. So those would be some observations.
You know, one observation I had to do with, and I hadn't seen this before, it's the way we're helping the maintenance and repair of systems, artillery systems, and others. And it's reminded me of telemedicine. And the 10th Mountain Division commander actually mentioned, and then he used the word telemaintenance. And that's what we're doing. And I think that's something we need to try to capture is, you know, the ability to repair things in the field in a way we never really had before, where you can put the, you know, the company's tech rep, technical representative for the piece of hardware, it might be BAE Systems, it might be, you know, Lockheed Martin. You essentially can virtually put them right there on the front lines when they need to repair something. Not something I expected to see. The Ukrainians are, you know, they're manufacturing parts, they can't make everything. They can't make parts out of titanium. You know, right now, that's a complicated machining process that they don't have the capability within the country to do. But there's a lot they can do. And I never, you know, really expected, and it's us, you know, with the assistance that 10th Mountain Division is giving in trying to repair their equipment in a way that I don't think we've done before. I think that's a specific lesson that we need to capture and try to expand on. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to our witnesses. General Rainey, thanks for the discussion we had about Futures Command a few weeks ago. I thought it was very illuminating. Last month, we learned about another delay with the Improved Turbine Engine Program, the ITEP, and it won't be expected now until 2024. These delays not only affect the new FARA aircraft, but also the already fielded 60s and 64s. Assistant Secretary Bush, in an interview with Defense News, you characterized the source of the delay as manufacturing challenges and not design challenges for GE Aerospace. I know the Army is briefing me next month on the finer details of ITEP, and I look forward to getting into this issue in depth then. But broadly, can you talk about the supply chain and component issues that are affecting ITEP? Is that what the manufacturing issue is, supply chain, or what's going on here?
Senator, frankly, it's quality control further down the supply chain. GE is responsible for all of it, but of course they have hundreds of subs they deal with. A few very important ones have had trouble building some of the new parts. For example, some of them are 3D printed. So we are using some new techniques here, making them at the quality levels needed to get engines to go to test. The good news is we did just last week light off the second test engine, so we are on a path to a better situation, but that is my understanding of the challenge. GE leadership is fully aware of it. I've had many conversations with them myself. They know we are watching closely. They know how vital the program is. They're committed to getting it right. Right now, I'm cautiously optimistic that our updated timelines will hold, but this will require constant attention, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very impressed with the Army and how they've developed the two new aircraft, and actually has always moved the timeline to the left, and now we're starting to slip right. So I am concerned about that. Are these concerns something that would affect other Army modernization programs like the next generation combat vehicles, the downstream supply chain manufacturing to tolerances? Is this something that's going to spread to other areas?
I don't expect so, ma'am. Of course, in aviation, we have the highest standards, is the most difficult things to produce. We've not seen anything like that recently with any of our ground vehicle programs, either the new ones like Mobile Protected Firepower or the older ones. But it's certainly a potential cause for concern. But I would say right now, I don't believe so, but it's definitely worth watching.
Okay, thank you. General Rainey, in our discussion last month, you described how Army Futures Command was reevaluating cross-functional teams and how the command is looking at the Army's new priorities and organizational changes. As you emphasized, the purpose of modernization is to drive transformation across the joint force. And I'm interested in hearing more about the integration across the total force and your 75th Innovation Command in particular. How does Futures Command integrate the experience of its reserve component members? Are there best practices for the Army at large to incorporate into other active reserve units?
Thank you, Senator.
I know, I just, like T-ball, I just put the ball right on top of the tee for you. Just,
So the 75th Innovation Command is a great success story of the total Army, right? So
Yeah.
it's not, you get this from Compo 1 and something less in Compo 2 or Compo 3. That's absolutely not the case. Some of the, when it comes to what I do, I'm trying to innovate, trying to find tech expertise without paying a whole bunch of money or taking a lot of time. So the fact that the 75th Innovation Command, General Marty Klein, I can call him and say, here's a problem, or here's what we think is a solution. We want somebody to troubleshoot, and his ability to reach out through his entire enterprise and find people that are not just experts by, the best people in the military. So a lot of them are the best people in the country in academia and industry, and being able to leverage that capability as we modernize it, the Army is kind of like a superpower. So absolutely, we should continue to expand it. As far as integrating across the joint force, I would offer Project Convergence as an example of that. It's our persistent experimentation approach, nested with exercises, and then periodically having capstone events. But we believe that Project Convergence is a Army-hosted joint experiment, and as every year, as we do those capstone events, they become more and more joint. We add more and more partners, and that's another way that we're continuing to apply a sense of urgency to our integration efforts.
thank you. I'm over time, but if you could reply for the records, I'd like to know what the Army's plans are to program and integrate Gray Eagle into the National Guard and active and reserve components. I want to make sure that the Army has a holistic view of concurrent and proportional fielding of weapon systems to achieve the total true force interoperability, so that the National Guard is also getting the Gray Eagle in a way that they can actually also train up and operate them.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
You could take a, General, I'm fine if Senator Cotton is, if you want to take that, and if you could talk about that briefly.
Yeah, I can talk about modernization of the total Army and transformation of the total Army. So General McConville has been clear and adamant, as I know, because I was formerly his G3, and there's no modernization effort we have that is Compo 1 only. They're all spread and prioritized across, and I will follow up with you on the specifics of the Gray Eagle. Mr.
Yeah, probably General Schmidt would be better positioned to answer that. I'm sorry. Should have asked you that.
No, that's okay, ma'am, but I would also just like to follow up with you on that one afterward.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I would add, if I could, Congress, we got the message. Congress was very clear about that capability in the Guard. We are in make it work, make it happen mode, with the Guard really in the lead in determining how they're going to build units, where, what composition with the MQ-1s that Congress directed.
Thank you.
So make sure you hang the right stuff on it. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Bush, I want to talk about the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS. It began a new stage of development recently. In December 2022, after several critical soldier touch points, the Army approved the purchase of 5,000 IVAS 1.1 systems. At the same time, Microsoft agreed to develop the new IVAS 1.2 system, which will, if successful, change the design of the system and improve its performance. FY22 appropriations included a $394 million reduction in IVAS procurement, citing the original spending request as ahead of need. In March 2021, the Army awarded Microsoft a deal worth up to $22 billion over the next 10 years to move the IVAS program from rapid prototyping to production. Mr. Bush, why has the Army included some IVAS funding in the base budget while shifting some funds to two different projects on the Army's unfunded priority list?
So, Senator, I think what you're seeing there is the Army trying to rephase that program. We unfortunately, we did a very difficult test with it and found all the problems. While that's good that we found the problems, still disappointing and not the outcome we were looking for. One thing I would say is our ability to restructure that program on the fly here very quickly to try to get to 1.2 is because of the new authorities we're using. That would have been almost impossible under a traditional system. To your specific question, we laid in funding we thought was sufficient to just get over the line to get 1.2 developed in '24. The U4 items would let us go a little faster into actual production if it proves successful this year, sir. So I think we are taking a deliberate approach, whereas the first time around was honestly very, very aggressive on timeline and production ramp up. This time we are being more cautious. We want to make sure, Microsoft, they have to deliver. This 1.2 system needs to be exactly what the Army needs, or we're not going to produce it. So I think, sir, that's one reason we scaled the funding back that way.
Okay. General Rainey, Mr. Bush hinted at my next question. How confident are you that the testing for 1.2 will be successful?
I'm very confident. It's not just the technical testing aspect, but one of the successes of our modernization effort is using soldier touch points. So because we have 5,000 of them, we are going to continue not putting them into operational units where there would be a potential impact, but we're going to not just let them sit in a connex somewhere. We're moving them around to places like the Maneuver Center of Excellence, for example, where we'll have some of our experienced soldiers continue to do that. We're working with Microsoft, so we have the users working hand in hand as we develop the next thing, and we're going to get it and we're going to test it with real war fighters and get that soldier feedback. So I'm confident both that we'll test it effectively, because we always do, the rigor that we put into the last one, but I'm really kind of, what I'm going to wait and hear from is the staff sergeants and the lieutenants and company commanders providing user feedback.
Okay. And if that testing does not go as well as we had hoped, the Army is prepared to take a look at the program?
Yes, sir. So institutionally for the Army, it's always a very hard decision to admit we can't succeed somewhere, but this is a potential area where, look, if the testing doesn't prove out very quickly that it's capable and going to get us what we need, the Army is absolutely prepared to end that arrangement and seek a new competition.
Okay. I want to turn in the time remaining to Abrams tanks, Mr. Bush. The Army's FY24 unfunded priority list includes $533 million for Abrams SEP version 3 procurement to achieve a complete armored brigade combat team set. Those additional tanks would decrease the estimated costs per unit from $17 million, that's 34 tanks at current funding, to $12.3 million, 87 tanks. And resourcing this requirement would accelerate the fielding of the M1A2 SEP version 3 tanks to one active component BCT by year. So the Army included 533 on its unfunded priority list for the Abrams tank procurement, but that seems to have become something of an annual occurrence, appearing on the unfunded priority list as opposed to the base request. Can you tell me why this seems to continue year after year of this funding for tanks going on the unfunded list as opposed to the base request?
So, Senator, of course, the Chief of Staff of the Army, it's his list in terms of why it appears there, but your question is a very fair one. I believe, as I mentioned, we have accepted some risk there in the base budget request. We don't think it's too low, but that is less funding than, as articulated in the UPOL, would be perhaps ideal. There is another mitigating factor, however, and that's recent increases in foreign military sales. So a very large order from Poland is going to end up being more than 300 tanks worth of work. Recent order from Romania will give us in excess of 50 or 60 or so additional tanks of work. And then there's, of course, potential for additional tanks for Ukraine long term. So we are always trying to balance between foreign military sales and our production to keep a healthy production line. But I think the chief, as articulated in the UPOL, believes that was an important one. It's a very large amount of money, so I think I would defer to him on his specific thoughts for why that was so high on his list.
Thank you.
Similar to tanks, I want to move to helicopters. Not something I have a ton of experience with. Though I did get to fly the Apache last year, out of Boeing in Phoenix, which was quite the experience. The Army has placed a big focus and resources on its future vertical lift priorities, the future long-range assault aircraft and the future attack reconnaissance aircraft. Neither of these systems are projected to field until 2030 or beyond, and they're going to augment, not replace, the current, Black Hawk and Apache fleet. And the Chinook remains the Army's only heavy lift capability. Yet, in large part, the Army continues to defer investments in the stuff we have in order to fund these longer-term two systems that are just going to augment what we have today. So does the Army still consider a manned reconnaissance aircraft the right solution here? And can you just, in general, just give me an update on the future long-range assault aircraft and the reconnaissance aircraft?
Thank you, Senator. And the short answer is yes. There's absolutely going to be a requirement for the United States Army as part of the joint force to conduct vertical envelopment in the future, now or any point. So the ability to avoid that attrition warfare I was talking earlier by maneuvering by ground and by air to dislocate our enemies and envelop our enemies. So we absolutely need to maintain what is the strength of our current Army, and that's Army aviation. So looking forward if you look at your specific question, there is always going to be a requirement for human reconnaissance. So reconnaissance and security isn't essential of warfare. You have to not get surprised, and you want to make contact on your own terms. How much of that can go unmanned versus manned is very much at issue, and we should be paying attention to learning from that. But the ability in an all-weather chaos, fighting the Chinese, who are very good at not only disrupting our technical capabilities, but also injecting mis and disinformation, the ability to talk to a human that you know and train who is looking at something and provide that back to the commander will always be a requirement. And where that falls out on our other requirements, it will be a decision that we'll make. But pursuing that capability, I believe, is the right thing.
Black Hawk's moving people, the Chinook people and equipment, and the Apache putting ordnance on target. I mean, those are missions that we can't, take our eye off of.
Absolutely.
And they're going to be around with these platforms, for a number of years. So, my concern is that we do have to, we have to focus on the future and beyond 2030. At the same time, we've got to make sure that that we continue to be able to support the warfighter with what he needs today, too. And I think that's those three platforms. Senator Cotton, do you have any further questions? Well, with that, General Rainey, Secretary Bush, General Schmidt, thank you very much for being here today. And the hearing